That happens a lot around here.
The title should say exactly what we're here to examine. But before we do, shall we do that delightful thing where we tangent off and attempt to be critical and academic before getting to the shameless gushing?
Why do I put up with you?
What defines a perfect movie? Most critical reviews tend to use star ratings, with 5-star movies naturally being the promised land. I myself tend to prefer ratings out of 10, and actually the difference between a 6 and a 7 is pretty crucial to my enjoyment of something. The first movie I ever gave a 10 out of 10 rating to was 2003's Peter Pan, and I stand by that. It's a great adaptation, and I love absolutely everything about it.
I do believe in fairies!
I also followed suit and gave a 10 out of 10 to 2005's The Lion, the Witch and the Wardrobe for similar reasons. I don't rate these films by going through every individual scene with a notepad and checking off every technical detail and being like, yeah, this scene accomplished what it meant to, because art and entertainment, and the enjoyment of it is very subjective. I grew up accepting the notion that perfect movies were the ones that won loads of awards, or grossed 3 times their budget at the box office. But then again, Peter Pan 2003 was a legendary bomb and got no significant nominations at all. But I've also sat through films that are extremely well made, well written and well acted, and well everything, and they might get a 10 out of 10 in terms of technical proficiency, but I'm not going to call them a 10 out of 10 film because I just wasn't engaged the way someone else might be. So if I call a film perfect, I'm declaring that it might not get an A+ in terms of technical proficiency, but that as a whole, its ingredients come together to make the imperfections part of the package. Or simply, it's just perfect at what it set out to do.
Pembroke scholars never wrote about this.
The Mummy is one of those movies that was very big when it was first released in 1999, and naturally got 2 sequels and some spin-off media, and then its terrible third film caused it to evaporate from consciousness completely until about the mid-2010s. The 20-year cycle meant that it was time to start getting nostalgic. People who had loved it as children started to remember it, and the inferior 2017 film undoubtedly redirected lots of goodwill and appreciation of what it did better. And nowadays, it feels as though everyone loves this film, although I'm sure to encounter many in the comments who don't, but it's impossible to deny that it's just so beloved. And that's all the more incredible, because the historical texts tell me that everyone involved thought this was going to be a career-destroying flop. First of all, this was going to be a remake. A loose one, still, but of a Universal horror film from 1932 starring Boris Karloff. And unlike Bela Lugosi's Dracula, or Boris's own interpretation of Frankenstein, it was not a pop culture defining hit, although it got respectable reviews from critics. Its sequels were more like reimaginings than continuations, often not even featuring the same character or actor in the role. So it's not as though The Mummy had the same brand recognition as Drax or Frank. Arnold Vosloo, who ended up in the title role, recalls arriving home from filming and his friends saying something to the effect of, "Why the f*** did you do a mummy movie?" Rachel Weisz, who played the female lead, worried that she was going to have her equity card confiscated. The remake even began its life at a modest budget of $10 million, leaning more towards horror, with the legendary George A. Romero writing and directing, and a modern set story more like The Terminator. It stayed in development hell for the rest of the 80s and 90s, with differing stories and directors, including a proposed Joe Dante flick with Daniel Day-Lewis as the monster. Although that one wasn't made either, the flesh-eating scarabs you see in the finished film come from that draft.
Flesh eaters.
Luckily, by the mid-90s, a not famous but still reliable director called Stephen Sommers approached Universal with the idea to make the Mummy movie an Indiana Jones-style throwback to the adventure serials of the 1930s, and essentially update the original film, which he was luckily a fan of, for modern audiences. And it just so happened that Universal had come around to the idea that it needed to be a higher budget period piece, feeling it would stand out from other contemporary films of the time. They still had one eye on a worst case scenario, however, and Brendan Fraser was mainly cast in the lead because he was cheaper than the likes of these guys who got offered it first, and he'd only just achieved bankability with George of the Jungle. Rachel Weisz was known more as a character actress exclusively in the UK and had to audition 5 times after the studio went through all the potential American actresses.
Always.
The shoot was expected to be a disaster, especially the 6 weeks in the Moroccan desert, involving sandstorms, scorpions, and beef ray nearly strangling on camera. With the prototypical effects and CGI of the day, Arnold Vosloo recalls not even having a clue what he was doing, and other actors expressed confusion as to what genre they were actually performing in. But they got out on time and on budget. So how did it all come together? Although it is a remake of the 1932 Boris Karloff film, it is a very loose one, and involves a number of similar beats, but ultimately does its own thing. In ancient Egypt, a priest called Imhotep fell in love with Anck-su-namun, who goes from being the princess to the pharaoh's mistress for a double whammy of forbidden. When their affair was discovered, Imhotep was condemned to a curse that barred him from the afterlife, but also had the side effect that if anyone ever read from the Black Book of the Dead, yes, I'm well aware that Egyptians didn't use books, go back to 2008 with that variety of criticism. Several centuries later, an ambitious librarian called Evelyn Carnahan is part of an expedition to the lost city of Hamunaptra where Imhotep is buried. So guess what happens?
You must not read from the book!
It's then a race against time to find a way to put Pandora back in the box before Imhotep becomes more visually appealing, but also more capable of world destruction / domination. And his biggest crime of daring to think of trading one of the most perfect people in existence to bring his mummified girlfriend back to life. Now, I already devoted a section on a video on underrated heroines to highlighting just how fantastic Evie as a character is, so I won't take too long repeating myself here, but I will say that she's one of the best heroines one could ask for in a movie like this.
Come on, Evie, faster!
Patience is a virtue.
A perfect mixture of exceptional in her abilities, and capable of being flawed and messing up, with an active role in the plot, and her own motivations in influencing the events.
And the Bembridge scholars have rejected my application form again. They say I don't have enough experience in the field.
And superficially, Rachel Weisz is just great in this role. She's able to have fun and kick up her heels, being part of the joke without being made the butt of it, and giving as good as she gets.
Didn't mean to scare you.
The only thing that scares me, Mr. O'Connell, are your manners.
Considering in pretty much everything else I've seen her in, she plays a serious, no-nonsense woman of power, except maybe Oz the Great and Powerful, which, yes, I think is quite underrated, it's definitely a novelty to see her in such a different light.
What is a place like me doing in a girl like this?
But like some of these British actresses, such as Keira Knightley or Emma Watson, who usually get consigned to serious period pieces, they do have a lot more to offer in comedy than you'd think.
Bloody pirates!
She approaches this role in a way that reminds me of Catherine Beaumont's voice work in playing my definitive Alice in Wonderland. Both focused on how British and proper they are, and played it in such a way that both think themselves the only sane ones in their stories, not realising their own oddness.
Can you stand on your head?
The dissonance there enhances the comedy, such as Alice reacting to things like this with mild annoyance, and Evie correcting grammar while they're being threatened.
It is time to make you mine, forever.
For all eternity, idiot.
She almost plays Evie as someone who will become a classic nagging schoolmarm in her old age.
That serves you right.
In an adventure movie, the woman would often be expected to be the one rolling her eyes and taking things seriously, so I really do have to applaud The Mummy for allowing the female lead to be the more eccentric foil for a more serious hero, while not making her a punchline or making him boring.
I am proud of what I am.
And what is that?
They can both be funny and competent.
I am a librarian.
But what about him? I find it increasingly rare to see a movie attempting to parody a typical 20s or 30s adventure hero without being mean-spirited and making him seem like a relic. And I get it. We sometimes need to reinforce that yes, we were far less enlightened in the days when there was only one Disney princess and look how far we've come, but it's also good to have a reminder of why this genre and character was so popular in the first place. Like the Western genre, which became so saturated in deconstructions and revisionist takes that the 2016 remake of The Magnificent Seven felt like a breath of fresh air for simply being a loving throwback. Rick is an affectionate parody of the adventure serial protagonist, and the film isn't afraid to poke fun at his attitudes while also calling attention to his virtues.
You're in her seat. Now. Yep.
His more period-accurate and therefore outdated behaviour is criticised by Evie, and their romance develops along the lines of him being receptive to what she says, such as him respecting her intelligence and competency when others don't, and the movie showing that they need her brains just as much as his brawn to save the day.
Keep him busy!
No problem.
The two are very much presented as equals and feel like a perfect match. Stephen Sommers has spoken about how much he enjoys putting romance into his films, and you can see that here. In fact, I recently read an article on the second film declaring it isn't afraid of romance and that's what makes it great. And I agree 100%.
I am going to kiss you, Mr. O'Connell.
Evie isn't some hashtag strong female lead who doesn't need a man ever. She sasses Rick to his face and then thinks of nothing but their kiss once she's in private, also grinning like a love-struck schoolgirl when she sees he's come to rescue her. Rick likewise makes an obvious effort to help Evie with her dig, albeit robbing someone else's toolkit to do so, has this reaction when she passes out before a second kiss, and is unafraid to say cheesy lines like this.
Guess we go home empty-handed.
I wouldn't say that.
And this is just my interpretation, but B-Frey seems to play the third act as not just a mission to save the world, but also going above and beyond to save the woman he falls in love with. There's even an air around this scene of him almost trying to show off and look cool for her.
Mummies.
And look, I'm overjoyed he got an Oscar for The Whale, which was an emotional roller coaster, but you're never going to get me to budge on what I think his most iconic role is. He brings it all here, from comic timing to action charisma and even genuine romantic lead charm. Whatever genre this movie is from scene to scene, he is on board wholeheartedly and is the perfect lead for it. And you know, sometimes with these supernatural sort of love triangles where you find yourself rooting for the female lead to end up with the monster, which is how we got The Shape of Water, well, this is one film where you're like, nope, Rick and Evie forever. But speaking of the monster, even though it was the second movie that had a pro wrestler in a prominent role, I kind of feel like Arnold Vosloo could be one himself, because he embodies Imhotep as a character so much I wouldn't be surprised if you tried to convince me he performed as this guy for crowds in a different city every night. Going back to what the article about The Mummy Returns says about leaning into the romance aspects, that's exactly what he chose to do. Just like how Boris Karloff took the 1932 original dead seriously in playing an undead monster looking for his lost love, Arnold Vosloo chose to play Imhotep like he was in Romeo and Juliet. It's not that he plays Imhotep as a tragic monster, that comes in the sequel, just as someone whose motivations are very clear and you know there's no stopping him. And even though this film is very effective as a comedy, Imhotep is also just as effective as a monster played straight. It wasn't going to be easy to do the transformation in reverse, where he starts out all decayed and with a face not even a mother could love, and then becomes more human with each American he drains, but he still manages to come across as just as monstrous through Arnold Vosloo's charisma and dedication to making this role work. And come on, having the 10 Plagues of Egypt as a superpower is just cool. We can go on about the chemistry between B-Frey and Rachel Weisz and how delightful Evie is as a character, but let's remind ourselves that this guy's presence as Imhotep is a major factor in why this movie worked. And his absence in Tomb of the Dragon Emperor plays a huge part in why that one is so terrible. He also deserves a lot of credit for managing to be a memorable presence in service of the narrative and not taking attention from the others, as does everyone else. I couldn't decide if I wanted to split each of these characters into their own section, but let's try and have some brevity. First we have Jonathan, Evie's brother, who we could tout as the less competent one if our introduction to this entire family wasn't this spectacle, so we can say it's probably just genetic in the Carnahan clan.
Hurry, Evie, hurry!
You're not helping!
John Hannah was a relative unknown, but had been getting good press for Sliding Doors, and he recalls being surprised that everyone was hyping him up as a great comic actor, telling Stephen Sommers, "I've never been funny in my life." Well, a few years down the line,
Once again, the gods spread the cheeks to Ram.
he had no idea what he was doing, with his direction often being mess around in the background and if it's funny, we'll cover it.
I've had worse.
Yeah, me too.
Clearly they were onto something because we love Jonathan.
Oh yes, I see.
He's genuinely funny, never annoying, and has some actually sweet, heartfelt moments with Evie.
You'll always have me, old mum.
you can buy these two as brother and sister instantly. And while Jonathan's buffoonery is played for comedy quite often, he's still given plenty of moments of competency.
Found it, Evie! I found it!
For a character that could have easily been pigeonholed into the sidekick, Jonathan is quite a success story.
You alright? Well, not sure.
Elsewhere in the supporting cast, a late 90s blockbuster had the foresight to realise that a story about white Americans and Europeans messing around in Egypt could use some actual Middle Eastern presence in there too.
I would pay £100 just to see him hang.
£200.
Proceed!
Ahmed Jalili fought for a slightly more positive representation of a prison warden, since Midnight Express was still fresh in everyone's minds, and the studio just wanted a generic sadistic thug.
Yeah, man! Of course we don't let him go!
The first scene he filmed was Evie trying to stop Rick from being hung, and the higher-ups wanted him to be fired for being too funny.
I'm a very lonely man.
He made his case to Stephen Summers and basically said, "The only way I can do this without being lynched by my own people is to make it slightly humorous." And it's not as though the movie doesn't poke more obvious fun at other nationalities.
Americans.
We also have Oded Fair a few years before he was the demon Zanku, playing Ardeth Bey, a Medjai warrior supposed to stop Imhotep from being awakened and who could really do with a class or two in communication skills.
I told you to leave or die.
His Plan B skills are top-notch though, and he helps the protagonists in putting the genie back in the bottle. He was supposed to die in the final battle, but Stephen Summers realised that he was way too cruel to be killed off. And do we have any opposition to that viewpoint? No? Good. I think my favourite shot in the movie might be Ardeth having the time of his life on the plane here, which is another shining example of how well this film works as a comedy. And my favourite moment in the sequel?
This was my first bus ride.
Bernard Fox is also delightfully British as Winston, and the four Americans are delightfully, well,
Americans.
Patricia Velasquez has only one scene as a Naxuna Moon, but definitely makes an impression, and I actually forgot that she isn't in the film more. The sequel expanding her role was a good choice. And we can't ignore the Stephen Summers regular Kevin J. O'Connor playing the thankless role of Benny, but we are very thankful for him in it.
I need a new job.
I kinda wish we'd seen more of him and Evie together, because they're quite the comedy double act.
You know, nasty little fellows such as yourself always get their comeuppance.
They do?
Okay, I've spoken enough about how well this movie works as a comedy, and indeed as a romance, but how does it do as the action horror it was advertised as? From the start, Stephen Summers said to the Universal higher-ups, "Nobody wants to see a guy wrapped in bandages. They're going to laugh at it." And even in the 1932 original, the bandages are only at the beginning, and Imhotep is made effective more through a combination of carefully chosen makeup and Boris Karloff's performance. So here we embrace the fact that the character was devoured by scarabs that don't actually exist, but I don't care, they're among many factors behind my fear of bugs. And for me, you can achieve scary if you don't care so much about that and focus on gross. The fact that the movie isn't presented as a horror is what makes it work as one. And so things like poor Mr. Burns losing his eyes and tongue, the boils and zombies, and this kiss? They're more effective at making me shudder than The Shining ever was. And considering the usual formula for something horror and comedy adjacent is to either be completely comedic the whole way through, or to slowly become more serious until the third act is basically straight horror, I notice how the movie dispenses with that. The first act is comedy, the second is horror, and the third is action, and each act still contains plenty of the rest. It juggles all these genres very well. The comedy doesn't stop the horror from being horrifying, and the horror doesn't stop the comedy from being funny, and both enhance the action rather than detracting from it. And the tragic romance played so straight in the prologue gives this story a not quite epic feeling, but definitely epic adjacent. And that is yet another tick in how strong the movie is.
Apparently even after 3,000 years.
He's still in love with her.
I can't even begin to separate the different genre beats to discuss them because they blend together so well. The iconic library scene is one of the best examples of cringe comedy that isn't from the golden age of Hollywood, also serving as the perfect establishing character moment for Evie.
Oops.
The riverboat sequence marking the first act turning point not only does that, but in quick succession, it utilizes every single member of the ensemble according to their character's strengths. Rick being kick-ass, Evie thinking on her feet and being pragmatic, Jonathan blundering his way into the right direction, Hassan being hilariously useless, the Americans being...
Americans.
And considering the 4 Americans and Dr. Bay are adding to an already sizable ensemble, it is very impressive that each of their deaths are memorable and help pace the second act very well. I'm a slasher movie fan, and my favourites are the less is more types like Black Christmas and Scream, so I don't think every kill needs to be spectacular, but it does have to serve the story well, and that is exactly what is done here. The third act in Hamunaptra does indeed make use of Stephen Sommers' preferred approach for action climaxes in splitting the protagonists into sets of 3, although it quickly becomes 2, alternating between Rick, Imhotep and the Mummy Priests, and Evie, Jonathan and Anck-su-namun.
Who touched him first?
I love Van Helsing and G.I. Joe 2, but the Mummy third act is definitely more concise. Like the riverboat sequence, each protagonist is utilised and contributes to the objective. Jonathan saving Evie from the priests and getting them to kill Anck-su-namun, Evie translating while at knife point and reading the incantation to make Imhotep mortal, and Rick doing all the cool stuff and delivering the killing blow.
He's mortal.
It is one of the tightest action climaxes in modern film, neither being anticlimactic nor overlong, and being suitably spectacular without feeling that's what it's trying to do. Stephen Sommers had previously done this to pretty good effect in his version of The Jungle Book, complete with fleeing a collapsing treasure room and the lead character being given respect by another at the end. Every director has to have a thumbprint. It's hard to believe there was once a reality where The Mummy not only didn't exist in pop culture, but when it began to, it was expected to flop. According to Stephen Sommers, and tests done by Universal, no one had any interest in seeing a Mummy movie at all, but it all changed literally overnight, thanks to a 30-second trailer that played during the Super Bowl. Expected to have a $20 million opening at the box office, it opened at $45 million, and quickly saved Universal from financial ruin. Naturally, a second one was greenlit immediately, and it was perfectly solid, and didn't make me want to beg the gods to erase it from reality like the horrendously bad third film. But we're supposed to be talking about things that make us happy here.
Awfully tempting, wasn't it?
So to answer the question in the video's title, yes, The Mummy is a perfect movie. It has imperfections like everything that exists, but it is absolutely perfect at everything it sets out to do.
Yeah? And is that my problem?
Well, it is everybody's problem.
Perfect characterization all around, enhanced by actors who knew what the assignment was. Perfect at being a comedy, a romance, an action-adventure, and even a monster horror. And the reason it's so perfect is why this video is shorter than the ones on Van Helsing and G.I. Joe. Out of all the Stephen Sommers movies, this is the one least in need of a defense, because everyone knows its worth.
No harm ever came from reading a book.
Shortly before the Renaissance started, there was a meme that went around from millennials and older Gen Zs thanking Brendan Fraser for making our childhood awesome. And when Arnold Vosloo was interviewed ahead of the 20-year anniversary, he put it best. The movie comes out and people go, "Oh, Arnold, you made a great movie." I'm like, thanks, but what you really want to say is, you should look at who wrote the movie. You should call that and thank them. So yeah, Stephen Sommers, thank you for making my childhood awesome. And because you did so, and I have yet to mature, you've been making my adulthood pretty awesome as well of late.